Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is John Schatzman, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Nscale. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar, Budgeting for IT Disaster Recovery, presented by our Chief Executive Officer, Paul Chandrini, and Director of Professional Services, Dan Linder. We hope that you'll find this webinar professionally interesting and time well spent. Before we jump in, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. The webinar today will be presented in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to interact with our speakers by using the chat or question sections of the GoToMeeting panel on the right of your screen. As many of you know, IT disaster recovery is a very broad topic, so do take advantage of the opportunity to ask questions about your particular infrastructure or areas of interest. So let's introduce our speakers today. Before becoming Nscale CEO, Paul Chandrini was CEO of HydroPoint Data Systems. Before joining HydroPoint, he was Chief Risk Officer for Bearing Point. He was also President and CEO for Plumtree Software. And before Plumtree, he was Senior Vice President of North American Application Sales at Oracle Corporation, reporting directly to Larry Ellison. And before Oracle, he managed Bearing Point's, formerly KPMG Consulting's, international high technology practice. And joining Paul today is Dan Linder, Director of Professional Services Program Office. In this role, Dan manages the team that helps Nscale customers efficiently integrate our platform into their infrastructure, offering advice and assistance on implementing IT disaster recovery best practices. Dan has over 15 years experience in software development, professional services, and IT project and program management. His expertise ranges from such diverse sectors as healthcare, biotech, and financial services. Before Nscale, Dan was Senior Project Manager at Wells Fargo, responsible for financial fraud detection systems. Before that, he was Director of Software Development at Property Sciences. And prior to that, he was a Senior Project Program and Process Manager for Nokia's Global Mobile Application Development. And before we get to the main section of the presentation, I'd just like to quickly give you a brief overview of Nscale. For the critical IT infrastructures of companies who need to keep disaster recoveries from becoming a disaster, Nscale provides automated, integrated, and cost-effective service that helps ensure your business continuity. Customers choose us because, unlike traditional backup and other cloud failover vendors, we automate disaster recovery of entire data centers, enable efficient disaster recovery testing, and help IT teams improve both local and remote backup functionality. Nscale is headquartered in San Francisco with multiple data centers in the US and the UK. So let's get to it. Now I'll turn it over to Nscale's CEO, Paul Chandrini.
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody, and thank you for your interest in Nscale. We're very appreciative of that, and you're interested in today's topic. Today we'll be going through the topic, really, backup and disaster recovery, primarily from a business perspective. And I know we spoke to everyone about how do you budget for this. But the topic is a little bit more complex, and I want to take you through a methodology so that what you're budgeting is very effective for your specific organization. As John said, any questions, please bring them up to us. We'd love to answer them for you. So we'll talk about backup and disaster recovery and the business drivers. What are the factors increasing the importance of recovery? Second, we'll talk about how to determine the risk tolerance for your specific business. How do we model our organization's risk profile? We'll talk about how we quantify the risk impact, and then how do we, in light of our risk tolerance, determine the best solution approach. And then let's appropriately figure out how to budget comprehensively for these particular solutions and look at the alternatives so we know what's best for our organization. When we take a look at the business drivers, basically, we really notice that there's been an increasing dependence on our IT systems to run our business. The proliferation of data is occurring at an increasing rate. Regulatory requirements, HIPAA, FDIC, FERC, FISMA, SOX, a number of them actually are all things that impact our business that we have to respond to. We have resource constraints. We're more and more concerned about security of our systems. And these are the qualitative factors that you need to capture in order to address your DR investment comprehensively. The impacts, I think, are all well known. The question is, how do we quantify these specifically for your business? And if we know what that impact is, we can cost effectively determine what an appropriate mitigation response will be. Downtime, we all know, is an impact to an organization, but how do we quantify it specifically for our organizations? At the highest level, Aberdeen Group says it's $74K per hour for a mid-sized company. Large businesses lose an average of 3.6% of their annual revenue. I mean, just basically due to downtime of the network. Think about that in the context of a $2 billion business. For our purposes in this modeling exercise, it's important to understand the risk for your individual organization and its context. Now, how do we basically do this? I really wanted to try to get everyone to take a look at what we really call a method to calculate the cost impact. And this is a model that I like, actually. Two key factors here, the labor cost of the outage and then the revenue loss. Not too difficult to quantify, but I think if you do a fairly systematic analysis of this, you actually create the business case that justifies the expenditure. Basically, it's people, time, the percent they are affected, the average employee costs per hour, and the number of hours, right? That'll give us our labor costs. And our revenue loss is basically the number of hours of the outage times the revenue per hour of your organization. This really starts step one of your quantitative analysis. The next step of this basically is to use a little bit of an enterprise risk assessment methodology. I know a lot of your organizations have a risk management function. Sometimes it's very formal, a chief risk officer. Sometimes it's basically in the finance group. Sometimes it's just really internal audit. All of those roles are familiar with these types of approaches. But this is basically used so you can assess your specific risk, design and implement your mitigation approach, determine how to best implement, support, and monitor its operations. So you need to understand the risks, understand what are the appropriate actions. You have to monitor whether or not you are getting the response that you anticipate and that you can sustain it over time. So a very simplistic model, but it helps you to put it in a framework, an effective framework. To give a very simplified example, this graphic captures the cause of the failure you identify and the business impact. And those failure causes, we've just actually given some examples here, but I would encourage someone modeling this to go into more detail relative to the specifics of their organization. Then we basically take a look at what is the particular effect, and it could be something as simple as losing a file. For example, I lose a file ahead of a board meeting and I don't have the content that my board requires. That is a disaster for me, both professionally and personally. But then it could be something as significant as basically there is a natural disaster, a hurricane, which brings down a data center, right? So there's a whole spectrum of causes and effects and how they impact your business, and then the individual applications and systems that run your business relative to prioritization exercise, and that prioritization that you should determine in advance while you're doing this exercise. Lastly, basically, what is the best response within constraints to minimize the risk to your business? Basically, how frequently do you need to take images of your data, and how fast do you need to restore service to your users? That's basically on the right-hand side of the slide, recovery point objective and recovery time objective. This is where we start to transition the business risk basically to the two key factors in determining how responsive your disaster recovery system will be. This is important to know as it's a key component of assessing the solution types that will work best for you and then their resulting budget impact. And we'll go through those as we go through the presentation. Now, when we're basically trying to calculate risk is fairly simple to calculate. It's really just defined in two dimensions. The likelihood of the event, so we have to identify those events effectively, and then what is the impact to the organization. When you ultimately do this, you can provide a score, and when we show you the next slide, you'll see basically a matrix where you'll actually aggregate the impacts and the scoring for the risks. So basically, the analysis should be used for each of the vulnerability point of your IT systems and the related business impact, and the score should be calculated and captured. Now, again, this is an example. We just hypothetically put this model together for you to take a look at, but the framework works and can be as detailed as necessary for you, and what it will do is it will quantify the risks to your organization and ensure that you've thought through it comprehensively. Simple spreadsheet like this, used to define the cost, the impact, and the probability based on your specific business, its systems, your regulatory requirements, and the specific downtime impacts. That should also yield for you what systems need to come up in what sequence to mitigate those impacts. This will provide you with a justification for the type of solution that will best meet your needs. Now, once that's all done, what we suggest basically is to use this share group definition of disaster recovery levels. This you can use basically to assess where your business is currently. Perhaps you have the right solution in place, and perhaps it's the most cost-effective for you. We're finding now over time that typically people do want to upgrade their service levels. They may want to automate them. They may want to look at taking expense out for the same service level. And there are many, many more options in the marketplace as technology's gotten more sophisticated. Basically, take stock of your current approach, rank yourself on the continuity continuum here, and then use your impact assessment to determine if your current approach is sufficient. Again, nice, formal, clean, tidy analysis. This slide shows solution types on the continuum. Typically, higher on the technology automation axis improves availability, which means improved RTO and RPO. And as you can take a look at the graph, what you basically start to see here is, there's more automation as we go to the right of the graphics page. And up on the top-hand right is basically what we kind of think is the nirvana for disaster recovery, which is that you have a dedicated infrastructure that 100% mirrors your production infrastructure. Now, typically, that's too cost-prohibitive for most organizations. And what we basically try to do, and certainly at Nscale, is to get as close to that as we can and in the most economically efficient way possible. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of the model. When we look at basically three buckets, if you will, of the type of approaches that are out there that we will present budget templates for, what we really see is sort of the do-it-yourself model, right? Mirror storage for backup, manually integrate your point solutions, there's vaulting, there's appliances, there's co-locations, a number of different alternatives. The key here is that these are typically point solutions, right? They're not necessarily integrated, automated workflow, automated testing type solutions with monitoring included. Generally speaking, the organization that goes this route has to maintain this themselves 24/7. And again, it's going to be contingent upon your risk profile and the appropriate response. Outsourced solution providers is really the next category that we've defined. And it's similar to do-it-yourself, except basically you now have this all managed by an integrator. The one differential that's nice here basically is that typically you'll get a service level guaranteed, but you do pay a premium on that as well. And again, in the context of your particular business constraints, this may make sense for you. Lastly, there's recovery as a service. This generally is end-to-end technology that's completely automated with a best practice workflow and is fully supported and will guarantee you a service level. And these are the three types that we think are the key categories right now available in the markets as solutions. So just really to summarize here, before we go into the modeling, we want to make certain that before you start to get into the budgeting exercise, you've taken a look at your risk tolerance and objectives, the service level that's required to meet your business's needs, the appropriate approach, take a look at the functionality in these systems, because they're not necessarily used all the time, but when you need them, they are mission critical. Understand the level of expertise that's required to operate them effectively, whether you have that in-house or not. How much automation do you want in the system? And then determine the technology, implementation, and support costs. Once you've done that, basically, you then can project the cost of the solution over a period of time, and we typically would say that's a 1 to 3 year period for your organization. We think that these are the key prerequisites before going into a budgeting exercise. And now, based on these alternatives, we've made some assumptions in terms of a use case, and I'll turn it over to Dan, who will take us through the models.
Thanks, Paul. Hello, everyone. I wanted to start by setting some assumptions here. This is the server list for a hypothetical company that is mid-sized enterprise level. It's typical of what my team works with. And you can see the numbers here on the servers, as far as the cores, the RAM, the storage, and the types of servers that we have. We also see here what the RPO expectation is. It's less than 15 minutes. And we have the RTO values of 2 minutes for files, 15 minutes for servers, and 2 hours to recover the entire data center. This particular hypothetical company may be currently on a 1 to 3 on the share scale and is looking to leverage newer cloud technologies so they can increase their data security and get up to a level or a tier 6 or 7 on the share scale. Okay, we're going to jump into the spreadsheet template, an example in just a minute, but first I wanted to mention that the objective of this IT disaster recovery spreadsheet is to give you an approach, a methodology, to map where your IT organization can improve on DR, RPO, and RTO, as well as reduce the project overhead for your IT staff. The goal for this exercise is for you to determine the variables that are important to your organization and use them to tailor an approach that makes sense for you. Because every company is different, we cannot assume every variable that you're going to run into. But we feel, after working with hundreds of companies to improve their disaster recovery preparedness, that this approach is useful, it's valuable, and it's a very good first step in allowing the data to drive your decision. Having said that, let's launch this spreadsheet template and review the approach, discuss some of our assumptions, and highlight how you can begin planning. I'm going to go section by section here. So here on the file recovery section, this section addresses the infrastructure and labor needed to replicate the data from production servers to a local device and to a remote site. To properly scope and design this to handle your immediate and your future needs, you're going to need to determine the amount of data that's currently in use, and you're also going to think about the amount of data that you're going to consume in the future and the rate of future growth. So it's time phased not only for the current time scale, but also how quickly are you going to grow in the future and what your total is going to be over that time frame. For the server recovery section, this addresses the infrastructure and labor needed to replicate the compute aspect of your production environment, to replicate your virtual servers from your production environment into a remote site. This assumes, of course, that your production servers are virtual servers. And to properly design this, you're going to need to determine the number of the types of servers to be replicated. So again, you can properly scope and size your compute capabilities in your remote site. Moving down to the RPO and RTO section. This RPO-RTO section captures the labor to install and configure and maintain replication functions for both the data replication and the server compute replication. Just as a reminder, the acronym RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective. This is the amount of time between snapshots. This duration determines the amount of data that you may lose should a failure or a disaster occur. Any changes from this last snapshot will be lost. And it's important to note that your increased server snapshot frequency, or a low RPO, also increases the load on the production server, both the CPU and your I/O. So users may experience significant latency. So you'll need to ensure that any servers that you want to have with low RPOs are built to handle this overhead. RTO, Recovery Time Objective, this is the amount of time required to make the latest snapshot available to the end users so they can continue working. This is where the risk analysis that Paul shared with you comes into play. How much data are you willing to lose? And how quickly do you need systems back online after a failure or a disaster event? Each system or application may have a different risk impact and probability, so the RPO and the RTO may be different for each system or for each application. Moving down to SLA. The SLA section speaks to system reliability, and this is related to your risk analysis as well. Uptime guarantee has two different components, and you need to think about both of these very carefully. One of them, most obviously, is the uptime when servers are running in the remote site, presumably after a disaster event or after a failure. System reliability can also include the reliability of replications and that they work in the remote environment when you spin them up. We've all experienced the frustration of having tapes not work when we need them to. So we want to make sure that reliability covers both the operational servers as well as the replication. Again, the reliability may be different between your servers or your applications. So you'll need to determine through your risk analysis what the business is willing to accept for each. The testing section is about the ability to test the system to ensure that the replication and the application stacks work as expected in the remote site. Remember that changes in the production environment are replicated to the remote site, so the setup in the remote site may be different than the production environment. And you'll need to make sure that the replications work in that different remote site as compared to your production environment. You'll need to test the production snapshots without having impact on the production network. And then consider for each server and or the application stacks how much testing is needed and how frequently that testing should occur. Moving down to capacity management, this section is about monitoring the system and expanding capacity when needed, specifically the storage and the compute capability. There's several factors that you'll need to consider here. Again, what is the expected growth rate of your server counts and of your storage? And what's the change rate of the data? If your replication solution moves just the deltas from your production environment to the remote site, then the rate of data change determines the amount of space or the size of each snapshot. Along with that is your retention schedules. How long do you retain those snapshots? How many do you retain? That all feeds into your storage calculations. Moving down to alerting and monitoring. This section speaks to a standard network and system alerting and monitoring system, which ensures that the servers are functioning properly. Existing monitoring tools can likely be extended to monitor the remote site with minimal cost. It's just simply a matter of extending your current licensing in your model. Integrated admin interface. This section is about the ability to administer your local and remote virtual servers. This ensures that your replications are occurring as expected, allows you to spin them up, turn them off, and manage your history of snapshots. Again, this speaks back to your retention policies and how many snapshots you're retaining on your system. An important question to ask yourself is, can your current network monitoring tools or your virtual servers adequately and easily monitor the snapshots to ensure that the minimal RPO is being set and is being met? Can your support staff easily use these tools to provide adequate and timely support? Moving down to the runbook section. This talks about the best practice of creating a runbook for your remote site so that the servers can be spun up should a disaster occur or a failure occur. And any configuration that needs to be made after spin up can be done timely and accurately. The provisioning here just speaks to integrating the individual components of the server, the storage, the networking, making sure it all ties together properly and has proper functionality. Compliance piece. This section addresses any specific technology requirements that might apply to your business based on your business's regulatory compliance requirements. For example, we have here worm-compliant hard drives. There might be others that are specific to your business that you'll need to include here. And the security control section. This looks at the technology and audit-based verifications. For example, many companies require some sort of data encryption, and some companies require ISO 27001 certification. And lastly, the implementation section. And this contains the effort needed to coordinate the overall effort needed to design and build a disaster and business continuity solution. It should hold contingency time for unknown unknowns that will surely arise in something of this complexity. And it also has the procurement and vendor management hours and costs that may not have been captured in other sections above in the spreadsheet. Okay, we're going to move on to a review of a few examples of the possible approaches. But first, I want to address a few important caveats about our use of this model in these examples. Populating this model requires unique inputs because every business has different needs when it comes to business continuity requirements, and labor rates are different across the country. So we tried to use reasonable numbers in our examples, and we believe that we've opted for conservative numbers. That said, you may find better pricing on some line items, which may offset other line items where we were a little too conservative, or it may offset the cost of additional line items that aren't included in our examples, but are relevant for your business. The models use the same hourly rate and sections across all three examples, and for an apples-to-apples comparison, consider the relative cost between the solution types, even though your do-it-yourself total might be lower than our example. Okay, starting with the do-it-yourself. Again, we'll walk through this section by section. The RPO and RTO section, I'll just scroll slowly through here so you can get a sense of what these sections have in them. So the RPO and RTO section here, a couple important points to draw out. The RPO requirement here is less than 15 minutes, which can be problematic because snapshots can consume CPU and I/O, as I mentioned earlier. So you would need to have a production server with the ability to satisfy this frequent RPO without causing unacceptable latency to your end users. The specifics around the RPO and RTO are solution dependent. Different technologies that you may use may have different RPO capabilities and may consume system resources differently. So it's something to keep an eye on and make sure you vet fully. Looking at the SLA, so 5 nines or 99.999% is not typical for DIY solutions. Technologically speaking, this requires a very robust design and redundant capabilities, which are usually cost prohibitive. So here we have a 94 to 96 uptime guarantee, which is more typical for well-designed and rigorously built DIY solutions. So depending on what your needs are and what your budgets look like, you may or may not be able to achieve something of this same percentage. Regarding support, this model also assumes that existing support staff will take on the support for the backup and recovery systems. And the hours that are shown here on this example are training hours where engineering team will train the support staff. I'm going to move down here to the integrated admin interface. The DIY approach will typically use a tool such as the VMware SRM to administer the virtual servers and replications. And these tools may or may not provide the information and or single tool or single interface that you need to easily monitor and maintain your systems. And as such, must be considered when you review your options and your approaches that best fit your organization's needs. And then regarding security controls, different businesses have different security needs. So what we modeled here was 3 man-months for each of 3 different audit groups: internal audit, external consulting, and then auditors, presumably external auditors. This may or may not fit your business need, but we thought it was a reasonable middle ground to include here. And then some additional comments here on the bottom. Accountability with a DIY, there's no external entity with a legal obligation to ensure that your solution works or that you receive your particular uptime percentage that you're looking for. Enhancements and improvements, there's no other users on the system to test and improve it over time to leverage that. So it's really about your team, your business, thinking of what you need to enhance and extend the system to test it to make sure it works properly, etc. And disaster logistics, question about disaster events. Who's going to run the DR servers while the disaster or after the disaster has taken place? And who's going to build a replacement infrastructure at the same time? It may be difficult for your resources in-house to do both at the same time. And will they be available? What percentage of resources might be lost either to the disaster, through mortality, or the need to go home and take care of their own families? And then other possible issues here. Resources with specialized domain knowledge and experience are going to be required to build and maintain and use the system. What's their availability in the marketplace and at what cost? What other competing internal projects exist that are going to compete for the funding and for the resources? These are all things to consider when you're looking at a do-it-yourself model. So let's move to an integrator approach. This integrator approach is to use the best-of-breed technology and approaches such as the Tier 1 data centers, mandatory redundant copies of your data. And they do this to ensure that they can meet the requirements and the commitments of uptime SLAs. And it typically is going to cost more than a DIY to build this level of robustness. So the costs are similar to a DIY model, which I'm scrolling through here now. And the integrators may get some leverage on reusable components. So they may get some volume pricing from vendors as well. So these cost savings may be significantly, if not totally, offset by an additional level of robustness required by the integrator. On top of that, the integrator is likely to add 30 to 50% margin, depending on the size, depending on the complexity, and depending on the risk of the system that they're protecting. So some additional notes here on the bottom. There is an external entity with a legal obligation to meet your SLA requirements and your uptime requirements. The solution is a custom integration, much like a DIY solution. So there may not be any other users on the system to test the system out, to find the issues, find the bugs, and to identify improvements over time. Your disaster logistics are the same as a DIY, and the possible issues are also the same as the DIY. Okay, lastly, we're going to move to the service provider example. So for the file recovery and server recovery sections, you'll see here, some of the expenses will still apply because we're going to need to have local and cloud servers for the data backup and the replication. So bandwidth, power, space, for example, will still apply. Most of these expenses are limited because you're not building a solution from scratch. You're leveraging an existing working solution. So you'll see here on the spreadsheet that many of these cells are marked yellow with the included indicator there. RPO and RTO. This section, you're going to likely need to install and configure the replication software. The hours have been reduced, however, because you'll be using a proven method or a tool that integrates with the rest of the business continuity system. Vendors will also support and train and assist you. I've conservatively used 3/4 of the hours that were indicated on the DIY example. Most likely, it'll take half to a quarter of the DIY hours, but I've been a little conservative and left it at 3/4 of the hours. In the SLA, you'll note that the 99 uptime is possible in this particular model because of the economies of scale provided by solution providers who have multiple users on the system. And they have also a 24/7 help desk support typically available. I've indicated here that we still have the man hours for the training in the spreadsheet for the engineers to be users on the production network. And what I mean by production snapshots are these are the snapshots that are being replicated from your production site. These are the same snapshots that would be activated in the case of a disaster or a failure. And we're able to spin them up in a testing network and would be able to test them to make sure that those specific snapshots would work. Capacity management. Just note here that with most service providers, there's an ability to easily see the capacity on the local and the remote systems. Adding storage is very easy to do, requiring minimal effort and minimal time from the client team. And expanding the compute aspect requires no effort from the client. It's all done on the vendor side or on the solution provider or service provider side. Alerting and monitoring. The admin interface that's provided by most service providers will likely include alerting and monitoring capabilities to some degree, and it's typically built specifically for the client to use with the system. And that's included in the price. So you don't need to purchase a different tool. You don't need to do custom software development in-house to get that capability. That also includes the alerting, monitoring, and the integrated admin interface sections here. You'll see here as I scroll past that a lot of the things we have in the DIY model are included in the service provider model. Here in the security control section, I want to note that because the data centers and the solutions have already been audited, you avoid the time and the hassle of managing the security audits and correcting findings. It's all included in the service. And then here in the implementation section, implementation should be a straightforward process because it's been done with other clients. The training, support, and testing on the system and the tools are typically provided in the service costs. And just a note here, at Nscale, we typically train the client on how to use the system and the associated tools. That's our approach. Going down to the additional comments here at the bottom, there is an external entity with a legal obligation to ensure that the solution works and the commitments and the uptime guarantees are met. Unlike the integrator, the service provider has multiple users on the system, so there's constant improvements and enhancements that are being identified, rolled out, tested, not just by one client, but by multiple clients that are on the system. Disaster logistics, while service provider staff may be able to help you with disaster spin-up, or in case of a disaster or failure, they can also monitor and run your remote site while your new resources build out your new infrastructure. So that's something that's unique to the service provider model that doesn't exist in the DIY and may not exist in the integrator model. And as far as the issues, possible issues go, there are a few. The architecture of the system, the tools, they've already been built out, they've already been tested, they've been used by multiple clients over a period of time. So you have relatively low risk. At this point, I'm going to bring Paul back in to do what he does best, discuss the numbers, the financial implications of the methodology we just reviewed. So Paul?
Thank you, Dan. That was very comprehensive and greatly appreciated. I hope that was helpful for everyone. It's interesting, when we take a look at this, there's some interesting comparisons here. Our analysis shows the value impact provided by the economies of scale from the recovery as a service model, and sort of it makes intuitive sense. And it's one of the things actually that's motivated Nscale and why we're so excited about our solution. But ultimately, we feel that if you work through this simple modeling exercise from the beginning to the end using the budgeting template, you'll be better able to determine what is best for your organization. Our team is experienced in how to take organizations through this analysis. If you need some help, please reach out to us, determining the best approach for your specific organization, and lastly, ensuring that you have considered all of the important cost parameters. So please feel free to download this. Please take advantage of it.
Okay, folks. On behalf of Nscale, I'd like to thank you for attending today. And thanks to Paul and Dan for sharing their insight into the budgeting for effective IT disaster recovery. It's a pretty broad subject, so what I'd like to make sure is that we do have some questions, and I'd like to turn these over to Dan and Paul to see if we can help anybody in the audience. Jason Brown asks, are we going to get these templates? And Jason, what we'll do is send you, all attendees, a communication via email, letting you know where you can download these. So Greg had that same question. Dean Connors has an interesting question. And his is, I noticed that none of these scenarios include connectivity to the remote site, e.g. bandwidth to the DR site for replication or end user access.
So in the template, we do have a line item up in the top sections where we have a bandwidth line suggested.
And what's interesting about that, too, I think, as you look at these alternatives, certainly with do-it-yourself and then generally speaking with systems integration, that's a charge. A number of the recovery as a service provider, they just include that in the overall costs. And when you look at ultimately the cost modeling slide that we had up a moment ago, you can basically see that with the economies of scale there as well, that generally provisions a much more cost-effective solution. So the other thing we'd like to understand too, and please feel free to ask any additional questions, is was this substantive for you and helpful in terms of helping you model for disaster recovery? Please let us know. You can email in right now. John can tell you how.
Just using the chat section or the questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel, you can submit your questions. So another question that we have from Bob Lambrecht is, what platforms do you support for recovery as a service? Windows, AS400?
Currently, we support Windows. We do not support AS400 at this time.
And Patrick has a question, and the question is, how many exercises are allowed per year? And Patrick, I assume that's testing, so maybe we can talk about that.
Sure. Testing, depending on what the testing needs are for each company. Some companies we find prefer to test once or twice a year, probably just because of other projects and resource constraints within their organization. Some other clients prefer to test every couple of months. So it depends. We're working right now on getting a scheduled testing process in place, and so this is going to be dependent on your organizational needs. So as we define more what you need, and we can work with you and help you out. Make sure you get the testing that you need.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Patrick Johnson has a very interesting question, it looks like, and he says, we are a mid-sized company, but do huge amounts of processing and store over 3 PBs 1,600 servers. Judging from your stats, this is a small shop by comparison. How does data get from primary to alternate hosted site? That's a great question.
There's some two different approaches. Typically, we can basically do it over the network. In your case, typically it would be best to be seeding that. I think that would be the most cost-effective way to do that, and typically we can support both methods.
Jason Brown has a question about replication scenarios. What OS or hardware platforms are supported?
So currently, we support the Windows platform. We can do some work with some Linux servers as well, but the Windows operating system, SQL servers, Exchange servers.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Another question from Jim Retu. Jim, I hope I'm not butchering your name, but the question is, does your Rafts support other virtual systems, like IBM P-Series, AIX, I-Series?
Not at this moment.
Yeah.
Okay, Jason had another question. Jason Brown, is there a technical reference I can review to understand how this could work in our environment?
Yeah, most definitely. Just please contact us, and we will connect you with our sales engineering organization who can actually go into a detailed analysis relative to the context of your infrastructure.
Patrick Walker has another question. In the event of a mass outage event, how is recovery services allocated? It's a great question.
Yeah, so as Dan had mentioned before, we have a number of disaster zones identified across the country. We basically do analytics on weather patterns, historical disasters, and density. So we ensure the capacity, basically, of each of the disaster zones. Regarding testing, what we allow people to do is rotate amongst those zones in 2-week intervals so that you can test as frequently as you would like. If you are doing your own testing, that's free to you. If you require our professional services to assist you in doing that, that will occur at a charge. The disaster zones are basically full capacity to cover the customer density in those particular areas, and that's actually something that's constantly monitored as we acquire additional customers. In addition, basically, we monitor all of the meteorological data that's available in the United States to ensure that we can be proactive in anticipating if and when a disaster will occur. If we anticipate a disaster occurring, basically what we do is we stop the schedule for testing, and we make certain that all resources are available for the customers in that particular disaster region.
Okay, Tadi Moncada, and again, Tadi, I hope I'm not butchering your name, has a question about where the data centers are located.
Nscale has 2 data centers in Virginia and in Texas, and also actually one in the UK. They're all ISO 27001, fully audited data centers, and that information is available to anyone who might be interested.
Thanks, Paul. Vincent Reyna has a question. Do you only provide Rafts, or do you assist with do-it-yourself or recommendations for hot site infrastructure, off-site storage, etc.?
Yeah, we are primarily a recovery as a service provider. We're not a consulting organization that will necessarily do sort of standalone professional services for do-it-yourself implementations. What we do encourage you to look at, though, as we had mentioned in the body of the presentation, is the cost efficacy of the do-it-yourself scenario in your environment. Certainly, if you're interested in looking at it as from a service provider, we would definitely be willing to provide you some assistance in that assessment.
Great, thanks, Paul. Patrick Johnson has a question. Are your sites utilizing shared resources, or are there dedicated islands for sensitive data?
So we have a shared resource model, but it is totally secure. There's no way that anybody else who's on the system will see your sensitive data. So I'd say kind of the answer to your question is a little bit of both. There is multi-tenancy, there is shared resources. That's where a lot of the cost savings comes from, and yet the security is totally intact.
Thanks, Dan. Greg Manson has a question. Do you have a SAS 72 or SSAE 16?
That's a certification for the data center, and that is correct.
Thanks, Paul. Jason Brown has a question. Are you currently using Windows 2012 HyperV features?
That actually what you should inquire with one of the sales engineers, and certainly if you route that to us, we will make certain that it's addressed.
Thanks, guys. And I should repeat to everyone in the audience that we'll be sending contact information that, you know, everyone's situation is unique. So if you have questions, we'll make sure we get the right technical people to you. So Michael Rossi has a question about some of our customers, and the question is, do you have any healthcare customers?
Yes, we have a number of healthcare customers, pharma, life sciences, hospitals, all in that category.
Okay, I hope that answered your question, Michael. Thanks, Paul. Tati Makanda has a question. If our primary data center becomes unavailable and we fail over to the Rafts service, is there a maximum duration we can use the service for?
Typically right now that's 30 days, right, that comes with the service. If it goes beyond that, we would have some additional charges for you, but the answer is yes.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Well, those were a lot of questions, and I think we're at the end of those. So as a reminder to everyone in the audience, all attendees will be receiving a follow-up email with detailed instructions on how to access the budgeting template we reviewed today. Look for that email within the next 12 hours or so. That email will also include contact information for any follow-up questions you may have for our team. We do hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we look forward to helping you in any way that we can. If you do have additional questions about how to apply the template to your organization, please use that contact information we send you to get back to us. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.